It's 8:58 in the morning and your badge won't scan. You swipe it twice against the reader by the elevator bank, and it flashes red both times, and the security guard, a heavyset man named Curtis, who has worked this lobby for 6 years and still can't remember your name, sighs and waves you through the visitor gate instead, like you're a problem he has to solve before his coffee kicks in. You mutter a thank you. You take the elevator to the 4th floor with people who make more than you and say less to you, and you sit down in a cubicle with a dead plant on it that was dead when you inherited the desk 2 years ago, and you open your laptop, and that's when the email arrives. Your stomach does something you don't have a word for. You open it at your desk, heart already going, and you read the first line 4 times before it means anything. The board has approved the resolution you filed through council 11 days ago. The resolution attached to a trust with your name nowhere on it, but your signature underneath everything. You are, as of 9:03 this morning, the controlling shareholder of the company whose badge just failed to let you into your own building. You sit very still. Somewhere down the hall, a printer jams and someone swears at it, and the sound feels like it's coming from a different life than the one you're currently sitting in. You close the laptop halfway, then open it again, just to reread the subject line, as if it might have changed in the 11 seconds since you last looked at it. You close the laptop for real this time. You look up. Nobody around you knows. Your manager, Todd, walks past holding a stack of expense reports and doesn't even glance at you, and you almost laugh out loud, because Todd has spent 2 years explaining your job to you like you're slow, and Todd currently reports, through 4 layers he will never see, directly to you. You watch him disappear into a meeting room, and you think, not for the first time, that if he knew, he would either quit on the spot or start bringing you coffee, and you're not sure which possibility disturbs you more. You spend the rest of the morning answering emails about a shipment delay you don't actually care about, nodding along in a status call, refilling your coffee once, twice, a third time, because your hands need something to do that isn't shaking. You go back 5 years to understand how you got here. The company had a recall, bad batch, a lawsuit, a stock price that fell off a cliff in 6 trading days. Everyone panicked. Layoffs hit 2 other departments that quarter, and you remember the fear in the building, the way people started eating lunch at their desks instead of together, like being seen socializing might make you look expendable. You remember a woman named Carla from Accounts Payable crying quietly in the stairwell, and nobody stopping to ask why, because everyone already knew why. Your grandfather had just died and left you $12,000, and you did something nobody in your family understood. Instead of paying off your car or putting a down payment on somewhere better than the apartment you were renting, you bought distressed corporate debt through a broker who barely blinked at the size of your account, because at that price, the debt was basically worthless to everyone but you. You believed the company would survive. You didn't believe it because you were smart. You believed it because you worked there and you'd seen the floor, and you knew the floor was fine even when the headline said it wasn't. You knew the warehouse still had orders backed up 3 weeks deep. You knew the recall was a packaging error, not a product failure, the kind of thing that gets fixed by Tuesday and forgotten by Friday. Wall Street didn't know that. You did. That was rule 1, and you wrote it in a note on your phone that night, the same night you sat on your kitchen floor eating cold noodles out of the container, because you'd spent your grocery money on brokerage fees. Never let your paycheck know what your bank account is doing. You didn't tell anyone. Not your girlfriend at the time, not your parents, not the coworkers who complained in the break room that the company was going under and they should all start applying elsewhere. You nodded along, you applied nowhere, you kept buying, a little each paycheck, the way other people build a retirement fund, except you were building something closer to a trap door. You started reading SEC filings on your lunch break instead of scrolling your phone, sitting alone at a corner table with a sandwich going soft while you cross-referenced debt tranches nobody else at your pay grade had ever heard of. 2 years in, the debt converted to equity in a restructuring nobody outside a boardroom paid attention to. You didn't do this under your own name. You did it through a trust your lawyer set up, one word, Ashwood, chosen because it meant nothing, traceable to nowhere, run by a corporate trustee who has never once met you in person and communicates with you exclusively through a law firm that bills in 15-minute increments. You are not in any org chart. You are not in any employee directory. You are, on paper, a line item called Ashwood Trust Holdings that shows up once a quarter in a filing Nobody in the building has ever opened, except the general counsel and apparently now you. You remember the first time you saw your own trust's name on an internal document, forwarded to you by accident in a mass email about quarterly ownership disclosures, and how you had to leave your desk and stand at the bathroom for 4 minutes just to breathe normally again. 3 years in, you own 19% of the company you refill your coffee cup at every morning. You still take the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator is slow and you don't want to be the guy who complains about it. You still ask Todd for PTO approval, typing the request into the same portal everyone else uses, watching the little pending icon spin for 2 days before it goes green. You still get denied the good parking spot because seniority goes to people who've been there longer, and you laugh about it in the break room like everyone else, because Rule 2 arrived around this time scrawled in the same phone note. Your visible life should never move faster than your job title allows. You start declining a promotion offer that year, a step up to team lead with a $6,000 raise, because a promotion means more visibility, more meetings with people who ask questions, more eyes on a version of you that's supposed to stay boring. Todd tells you he's disappointed in your lack of ambition. You apologize and mean it in a way he'll never understand. You go home that night and sit with the sting of it longer than you expect to, because some old, unrewired part of you still wanted the raise, still wanted to be seen as someone who was going somewhere. And you have to remind yourself that you are already somewhere no promotion could ever take you. 4 years in, an activist fund tries a hostile buyout. This is the moment everything nearly breaks. Your trustee calls you, panicked in the calm, clinical way lawyers panic, and says a fund called Barrow Capital is quietly accumulating shares and has requested a board meeting. You almost tell someone that day. You almost walk into HR and say something, anything, just to release the pressure sitting behind your ribs. Instead, you hire outside counsel Barrow has never heard of, a woman named Laura Bennett, who has spent 15 years doing exactly this kind of quiet defense for people who don't want their names in a press release. She tells you one thing on your first call that you think about every day since. Ownership is loud if you let it be, she says. Control is quieter than ownership. Most people never learn the difference, and it's the only thing that will save you. You retain her through the trust. For 6 weeks, you live 2 lives at a pace that feels unsustainable, drafting proxy language with Laura at midnight over encrypted calls, then sitting through 9 a.m. stand-up meetings where Todd asks if anyone has updates on the printer-toner situation. Nobody at Barrow Capital ever learns that the deciding vote against them belongs to a payroll employee 2 floors below the boardroom they were trying to buy. You win? Barely. It costs $600,000 in legal fees, all of it routed through Ashwood, none of it touching your personal accounts, which still hold at that point a checking balance of $4,300 and a 401k you contribute to at the company match like every other employee in the building. You go to work the Monday after the vote closes and clock in 11 minutes late because of traffic, and your shift supervisor writes you up for it, and you sign the write-up without a word, because contesting it would mean explaining a version of your week that no one is allowed to hear. You drive home that evening and laugh so hard in your car, alone in the parking lot, that a stranger 2 spaces over glances at you like you might be having some kind of episode. By year 5, your stake sits at 34%. Combined with 2 smaller allied trusts your lawyer helped you quietly assemble over 18 months of careful, unhurried accumulation, you control 51% of voting shares. You are, in every legal sense that matters, the company. You still eat the cafeteria's Tuesday chili because it's the cheapest thing on the menu and you've eaten it every Tuesday for 5 years, and changing that now would be its own kind of confession. You still drive the same 2014 sedan with a check engine light you've stopped noticing, parked in the far lot because the close spots belong to people who've earned them the visible way. Sometimes walking across that lot in the rain, holding a soggy takeout container over your head, you think about the fact that you could buy the entire parking structure outright and never notice the dent in your balance, and the thought feels less like power and more like a joke only you're allowed to laugh at. This is when the psychological weight gets strange in a way the other version of getting rich never would have. You sit in all-hands meetings and watch the CEO present numbers to a room, and you already know the numbers because you approved the deck through council a week earlier. You watch your coworkers speculate about layoffs in hushed tones by the printer, and you already know whether they're happening because you're the one who will ultimately have to sign off. You start to understand something nobody warns you about. Money hidden in a bank account is a secret. Power hidden inside the room you sit in every day is a performance that never, ever stops, because the room doesn't know it's being performed for. Every meeting becomes two meetings happening at once, the one everyone else is in, and the one only you are in, where every comment, every joke, every complaint about management is quietly, invisibly about you. You start clocking your own facial expressions in real time, making sure you nod at the right moments, laugh at the right jokes, complain about the right small injustices, because being too calm, too unreadable, is its own kind of red flag if anyone ever bothered to look closely enough. You start dating someone that year, a woman named Elise who works in a completely different industry and has no idea what your job even involves beyond logistics, boring stuff. She asks, 6 months in, why you never talk about wanting to move up, why someone as sharp as you seems content coasting in the same role year after year. You tell her you like the stability. It isn't a lie, it's a smaller truth hiding a much larger one, and you feel the gap between those two things widen a little more every time you let it stand. She meets your parents. She meets Todd once at a company holiday party you almost skip and then don't. And she laughs politely at his jokes about spreadsheets, never knowing she is being polite to a man who works for you. You start noticing your coworker Sarah differently. She runs financial operations 2 desks over, sharp, quiet, the kind of person who reads footnotes other people skip. Around month 3 of your controlling stake, she mentions, almost offhand over lukewarm coffee, that she noticed something strange cross-referencing shareholder records for an audit. There's a trust that's shown up more and more the last few years, she says, not looking at you directly. Ashwood something. Whoever it is basically runs this place now, and nobody I've asked seems to know who they are. Your hand goes very still around your coffee cup. Corporate stuff, you say. Boring. She shrugs, and for a second you think it's over, and then she says, almost to herself, weird, though. Their filing address is 2 blocks from your apartment. You laugh like it's nothing. You go home that night and don't sleep, running the paperwork in your head, checking every seam for a thread she could actually pull, and you find, with the same sick relief you'll feel every time this happens, that the seam holds. Coincidence? A guess. But now you know Sarah notices things, and you start being careful around her in a way you weren't before, steering conversations away from anything with a shape she could follow, timing your bathroom breaks to avoid the moments she seems most likely to circle back. Weeks later, at a co-worker's going-away happy hour, someone jokes about how the mystery shareholder is probably some hedge fund guy in a different state who's never even set foot in the building. You laugh along with everyone else, and then, because you've had 1 drink too many and the isolation has been sitting on your chest for months, you say, without quite meaning to, maybe they're closer than everyone thinks. Sarah, 3 seats down, goes quiet and looks at you a beat too long. You change the subject fast, but you drive home that night replaying the sentence 50 times, wondering if you just handed someone the one thread you'd spent 5 years making sure didn't exist. You don't sleep. You lie in the dark, running through every version of the conversation, every possible way Sarah could take that sentence and pull it somewhere you can't afford it to go. She doesn't bring it up again for 2 weeks, and the silence is somehow worse than a direct confrontation would have been. You find yourself watching her in meetings, trying to read something in the way she takes notes, the way her eyes move when ownership structure comes up in a budget discussion. You start to understand, in a way you hadn't fully before, what Laura meant when she said control is quieter than ownership. It isn't just about the paperwork. It's about the exhausting, constant vigilance of making sure the quiet never cracks, of scanning every room you walk into for the one person paying closer attention than they should. Then, on a Thursday, Sarah stops by your desk with a printout, and your stomach drops before she even says anything. But it's just a spreadsheet error, a rounding issue in a departmental budget, nothing to do with Ashwood at all, and you laugh with relief so visible that she asks if you're feeling okay. You tell her you didn't sleep well. It's the first fully true sentence you've said to her in a month. The final test arrives 11 months later. The company's largest division, the one that employs 340 people, including you, technically, on paper, before you were anyone, is underperforming. The board you control through a trust nobody sees, recommends closing it and moving operations overseas to protect margin. The math is clean. The math says close it. Todd would lose his job. Sarah would lose her job. The version of you that clocks in at 8:58 every morning and gets denied parking spots would, on paper, lose his job too, since Ashwood's ownership has nothing to do with your employment contract, and severance packages don't check whether the employee receiving them secretly controls the company issuing them. You sit alone in your apartment at midnight with the vote in front of you, the same apartment 2 blocks from the filing address Sarah mentioned without knowing what she was really pointing at. And you think about the dead plant on your desk that's been dead for 2 years because nobody, including you, ever had the standing to just throw it away. Elise is asleep in the next room, unaware that the man she's been dating for a year is, at this exact moment, deciding the economic fate of 340 strangers, with a signature no one will ever trace back to him. You think about telling her right now, waking her up, saying all of it out loud just once to hear how it sounds outside your own head. You don't. You sit with the resolution open on the screen, cursor blinking over the vote field, and you understand, more clearly than you have at any point in 5 years, that this was never really about the money. The money was just the door. What's on the other side of it is a version of power that nobody can see you holding, which means nobody can ever help you carry it either. You think about Laura's voice on that first call 4 years ago now, the one about control being quieter than ownership, and you wonder for the first time whether she meant it as advice or as a warning she assumed you'd only understand later. You think about Carla crying in the stairwell 5 years ago, about the version of yourself who watched that happen and felt powerless to do anything but keep his head down and count his loose change. You are not that person anymore, not in any way that matters on paper, and yet here you are at 1 a.m., discovering that having the power to change an outcome and having the freedom to actually use it turned out to be 2 entirely different kinds of wealth, and you only ever managed to build one of them. You have the deciding vote. Nobody in that building will ever know it was you who cast it, whichever way it goes. You could vote to save the division and call it a business decision framed by counsel as a long-term brand value play nobody would think twice about. Nobody would ever connect it to a version of you that used to eat cold noodles on a kitchen floor because you couldn't afford both dinner and a stock purchase. Or you could let the math win the way the math has been allowed to win every other time this year, and walk into work tomorrow exactly as invisible as you walked in today. So here's the only question that matters, the one you still haven't answered at 1 o'clock in the morning with the resolution open on your laptop and your badge still not working the next day either way. If you had the power to save the job of the person sitting 2 desks away from you and using it meant the whole quiet architecture you built over 5 years might finally come apart, would you use it? Or would you let the vote go through clean, walk into work tomorrow, swipe your badge against a reader that still won't recognize you and say nothing at all?